Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. Wrecking Ball MP Lee Anderson has thrown the Tories into chaos, or at least a different kind of chaos. We'll discuss the party's Islamophobia problem, pressure on the right from reform, and whether the One Nation Tories have a serious plan to save the party from going the way of the MAGA Republicans. Plus, it's a But Your Email special in the second half. We answer your burning political questions. And in the extra bit for supporters, political marches can be strange and chaotic alliances with people you don't always want to be walking alongside. The panel will discuss their own protest experiences. Let's meet the panel. First up, comedian Matt Green, currently on tour across the length and breadth of this sceptred isle. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
How's England treating you?
Very nice. And Scotland too, and Wales. They've all been very nice so far. And it has actually been really lovely. I've met quite a lot of Oh God, What Now supporters and fans on the road as well. It's been really nice.
Lovely. Once again, you see that I managed to omit Scotland and Wales to the aggravation of listeners. The Post Office inquiry continues to generate heat. What have the latest witnesses revealed?
I mean, it was quite an interesting and fairly revealing sort of evidence session yesterday. Henry Staunton, the former chair, stood by his claims that the government tried to slow down compensation. But that was almost the least of it. There was a whole bunch of other revelations which made the committee hearing. Several members of the committee were saying things like, that's blown my mind, which is something you don't often hear, I think, in a select committee.
That's really good. That's more like if you're like a TikToker or whatever. You know what I mean? Like exaggerated surprise.
Yeah, it was quite funny. Henry Staunton revealed that Nick Reed, who's the CEO of the Post Office, has been since 2019, is under internal investigation. He said that this investigation was the investigation that Kemi Badenoch was talking about in relation to Henry Staunton leaving. So that was a bit confusing. He said that Reed threatened to resign over his pay deal, which is over £400,000 a year plus perks, which seemed to completely contradict his own evidence earlier when he denied he'd ever threatened to resign. Nick Wallace, the journalist who wrote the great Post Office scandal book, tweeted that this was the most important committee hearing on the scandal since 2015 and that the whole thing was, quote, madness. So it's worth looking back at. And Alan Bates, obviously, who's the star, as it were, of the TV show, said earlier in the day that he was basically very frustrated that the thing was taking far too long. And he made it clear that it was a redress scheme. It wasn't a compensation scheme because this was money that they absolutely were owed. It wasn't a question of the government deciding to help them. It's like, no, they are owed this money. It is their money. And he described the Post Office as, quote, a dead duck that should be sold to Amazon for £1. Which does raise the question of whether you'd have to subscribe to Amazon Prime to guarantee being able to pick up a parcel.
Now, I do respect Alan Bates, but I'm not sure about his economic ideas there. I think that we might need to run that through the committee process, perhaps see what the Lords have to say.
See what Netflix thinks.
Yeah.
You know.
Open it up to all Disney Plus.
Yeah.
Next, we have Guardian columnist, author and podcaster Rafael Behr. Hi, Raf.
Hi, Dorian.
When they're not voicing half-hearted disapproval of racism, the Tories are allegedly running the country. Jeremy Hunt has been dropping teasers about March's budget, which the IFS has called dubious and lacks credibility. What's he saying?
Well, look, essentially the Conservative Party has, in terms of fiscal policy, coalesced around the sort of fetish for tax cuts, and they've sort of attached themselves to this idea that the only thing that can save them and the economy would be cutting taxes. And Jeremy Hunt is under pressure, obviously, to deliver something in that area. So, it depends who you ask, or depends what you read on a particular day of the week. A bit of inheritance tax cut, a bit of national insurance cut for employers. And what it ultimately comes down to, well, there's two elements to this, aren't there? One is a sort of a macroeconomic argument that only by cutting taxes will you stimulate growth, and that's what will save us from stagnation and economic ruin. And that's a very old argument. The evidence would suggest that's not actually what the country needs. I think the broader peculiar issue here is that actually the Conservatives know that they are most going to lose the next election. And so their definition of success is damage limitation. And so anything that you might try and give people a little bit of feel-good factor in the run-up to election might just save a few seats. And then the question of what happens after an election, which is there will be no money, all the budget projections on which you are allowing yourself tax cuts are founded on a notion of spending cuts baked into the next parliament, which will simply never happen. I mean, it would involve sort of basically abolishing most public services as we know them. It's a total delusion and a fantasy, this idea of fiscal headroom. But they all know that's Labour's problem. And yet they are pretending by saying this thing is Labour's problem. But also the test for credibility of Labour as a party of government is if they stick with our weird fantasy of what Labour. I mean, the whole thing is so sort of tangled up in weird Tory fantasy lands that it almost shouldn't be dignified with serious discussion. But then I just wanged on about it for 2 minutes.
Well, my wife was complaining the other day about one or other aspect of the broken public realm. And I did have this sort of moment of clarity. And I just thought, like, the one thing that I would do if I was Labour Prime Minister, I've made no effort to become one. But if I were, I think actually just making things feel like they're working again is the job.
Absolutely.
Like that is the top job. And so, of course, you know, that which is why I get very frustrated with Rachel Reeves going, oh, we haven't got any money or whatever. And so this thing makes me particularly angry because that is what is causing so much anger and frustration, disillusionment in the country. Of course, that fosters anti-immigrant sentiment and the sheer cynicism of going, but what if even less money for public services?
Well, the interesting thing, if you talk to Labour MPs who are all at the moment very loyal to Keir Starmer, and if you raise this question of like, if only he could just be a little bit more dynamic and charismatic and win some of these arguments, actually win an argument in public about the fact that what we really need is to invest in the future. That's going to involve some spending, it's going to involve some borrowing, and it's going to involve some taxing. And that's the only way we reconstruct the country. Why doesn't he do it? And, you know, they sort of cavil and squirm and they say, well, you know, the waters we swim in, the environment we're trying to deal in has been so framed, the whole debate has been so set up to favour, you know, all of British politics is kind of an away fixture. And until we've won, we don't get to make that argument. I do think, you know, that there is a wider problem here, which is that it can be simultaneously true that the tax burden is at historically quite high levels for the UK, not by European standards, and also we need much more public spending and probably to borrow more and higher taxes. So, you know, those things can be true at the same time. And that goes back, I mean, decades, generations. I mean, that's a function of having, you know, blown all the North Sea oil revenue. That's a function of having blown all the sort of proceeds of privatisation. It's not just something that's happened in the last couple of years. So that's the argument you want Keir Starmer to start winning, to say, look, this is, we are having to rebuild this country, you know, over, you know, in the long haul. And unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be great. And Rachel Reeves doesn't seem to be great at changing that frame.
And finally, Hannah Fearn, who writes about social affairs for the likes of The Eye and The Observer. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
The by-election from Hell takes place in Rochdale on Thursday. Later listeners will know the result already. Tell us about the final stage of the campaign. Did it get any uglier? It was pretty bad about 2 weeks ago.
It's really bad. The last week, really, it's a combination of both aggression and apathy, really. That's sort of all there is going on. I think Rishi Sunak really summed it up in Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday, which is when we're recording, basically saying 3 of the candidates on the ballot are former Labour members, 2 of which are anti-Semites. He's talking about Galloway and Ali there. Obviously, we must say they both deny that claim. It's basically a front runner, which is really frightening. He's campaigning on the absolutely insane claim that the vote for him is being watched in Tel Aviv.
Oh, it's going to be the shot heard round the world, isn't it?
Well, that's his standpoint. Then Reform's campaign tactic, also ex-Labour, Simon Danjuk, is basically saying, I'm standing to stop Galloway. That's his entire campaign trail, which is in itself sort of understandable, although he's a despicable character and not somebody we would want to see. And obviously standing for Reform, a party we do not want to see break through. I think highly likely they will come second. He has received, incidentally, death threats on the trail, and a man has been arrested for attacking him. So, you know, very chaotic scenes on the trail. But Greens have someone on the ballot they've entirely withdrawn from campaigning in the area. The Tories have let their candidate Paul Ellison go on holiday within the last week of the campaign. And the really, really sad thing for me is that the Lib Dems are completely invisible here, and they're the only party saying anything sensible at all on the trail. They're talking about the hard graft needed to repair the country and particularly the local area. They're talking exactly as you were just saying, Dorian, about the nature of public services, the broken public realm. They are speaking about this, but nobody is listening to them. They're entirely invisible. And this is an area where 28% of children are living in poverty. And that's the really depressing thing for me, that this area needs, is desperate, is crying out for a strong, serious candidate, and they don't have one.
I can't think of a worse by-election campaign.
No, it's embarrassing. It should embarrass us all that it's been allowed to descend into this complete farce.
Suspended MP Lee Anderson has semi-apologised for claiming that London Mayor Sadiq Khan is in the pocket of Islamist extremists. We will get into the wording, but he has done his party a favour by distracting from Suella Braverman's claim that the entire country is in the pocket of Islamist extremists. Anti-Semitism on the left has been big news for years. Is it high time we paid the same attention to Islamophobia in the Tory party? And what does this racist ruckus tell us about the future of the Tories as Reform and One Nation MPs fight for the right? Raf, what did you make of Anderson's quasi "I'm not a racist but" apology in the Daily Express?
Well, it's interesting, I suppose, that ultimately he felt he had to sort of clarify his comments to some extent. He wants to keep the door open to being admitted back into the Conservative Party. The distinction he has tried to draw is between or the clumsiness, the infelicity in language that he will own up to is conflating the vast majority of Muslims, which he says
99.9%.
99.9% are peaceful, law-abiding, good citizens, and he ought to have been clearer about that he was only singling out the 0.1%.
He should have been clear with his claim that the mayor of London is in the pocket of 0.1% of Britain's Muslims.
And this is, I think, the crucial thing, and this is the bit that, as yet, no Conservative I have heard articulate the precise problem, which is, and it's this keyword control. It's what makes, apart from the fact that it's all, a lot of people will recognise generally a kind of a dog whistle tone where you're talking about a collective threat to society channeled through the person of, oh, guess what, the Muslim mayor of London, who isn't a white man, So there's also, it's not rocket science to think there's a bit of a bad smell around this, but particularly that the use of that word control, the sense that Sadiq Khan is a kind of Manchurian candidate, kind of sleeper cell, that he's a conduit for something other than what he appears to be. And that element of it, for me, is what really gives it a more aggressive, sinister edge. That he's saying that the inference is that, the audience that he's speaking to is people who will look at Sadiq Khan and absolutely ignore his very good record on being a secular, ecumenical, I think quite sensitive mayor of a complex multicultural city who's actually governed with a lot of sensitivity to some of the complicated sensibilities of the capital's various communities, including its Jewish community. And Lee Anderson was speaking to an audience who will discount all of that because they will only see the fact that he's a Muslim, and they will only see the colour of his skin and project onto that a load of assumptions about what he really believes and what he really represents. And that's both racist, I think, but it's a particular kind of paranoid prejudice that gets into conspiracy theory, and that's that's a sort of exquisitely aggressive kind of prejudice.
Well, it's like the idea that Starmer is a sort of Zionist puppet, and you can disagree with his position on Israel and Gaza, but it's that particular language of you are being controlled by foreigners.
And this is where I think Islamophobia, I mean, it is quite a contested term. And there are, I've heard criticisms of it that say, well, it doesn't really describe something coherent enough, or it's used as a blanket term to sort of shut down legitimate debate about the fact that there are fanatical radical Islamists who believe things that you wouldn't necessarily want enacted in government in a democracy. But actually you get exactly the same symmetrical argument when people say, oh, well, you're just brandishing around the term anti-Semitism to stop people doing legitimate criticism of Israel. And then all these things get conflated. And actually, Islamophobia, I think, is actually quite a useful term, because what you're zeroing in on is not quite the same as, it's not a racism in the sense that I think there aren't that many people who believe racist things or will profess racist opinions in a kind of 1930s eugenic racial hierarchies of superiority. There are white supremacists, but they're actually a really tiny number. Whereas there is a much wider perception that there's something cultural about Islam as a belief and a culture and a faith that makes it just sort of immiscible with Western democracy. It's just Muslims, unlike other communities, simply cannot integrate the way other communities have. And that's a very particular kind of prejudice. And I think that's where I find Islamophobia quite a useful word, because that's what they're really inferring.
Well, let's look at the word, Hannah. Lee Anderson calls it a fear of Islam and insists he's not scared of Islam. Much as I remember many years ago, homophobes would go, but I'm not scared of gay people. I just don't like them. That's not actually what it means. Kemi Badenoch thinks it would let in a blasphemy law by the back door and prefers the term anti-Muslim prejudice, although to my knowledge, no Tory MP interviewed on television has even used the phrase anti-Muslim prejudice.
No.
They don't want to talk about that.
I think I heard one actually
Right.
on the, but the actual. It's interesting because Islamophobia, I think we all have a general understanding of what it means. Clearly, all of us have come to this table today understanding what it means. You don't need a rigid definition, and the government hasn't got a formal definition, and the government and the current cabinet are now playing on that. They love that because they can stand up and say these ridiculous things.
There are competing
it's all about
definitions,
fear.
and I wonder sometimes whether Muslamophobia would be a clearer word, because there's different definitions. And one definition says prejudice against Islam, the religion, and one says prejudice against Muslims.
Yeah.
Which is quite a different thing, because anti-Semitism is seen as a prejudice against Jews, not against Judaism.
They're trying to conflate, because of their obsession with freedom of speech, the difference between criticising Islamism or Islam as a practice and individuals. They're very different things. It is possible to have legitimate debate about all manner of issues without becoming prejudiced, without resorting to these assumptions and these dog whistles. And so I think Islamophobia is a perfectly okay word, and I think it's also absolutely right to be able to say that what we heard Lee Anderson say is an example of Islamophobia.
There's so much disingenuousness in precisely this debate, because the reality is, as you just said, it's possible to articulate subtleties around these issues, and you can sometimes get the words a bit wrong or misspeak or not express yourself perfectly. But no one for a moment thinks that Lee Anderson or when Suella Braverman writes a piece in the Telegraph saying that Keir Starmer, is in hock to Islamists and that they have bullied the entire country, that no one thinks for a second that she was carefully choosing those words.
Right.
So it's such a willful refusal to do exactly the diligence on language that actually anyone who pauses for a moment to think, I'm trying not to stir hatred, I'm trying not to benefit from polarization, I'm trying not to basically fuel my own political engine on a bit of vitriol here, they would make that effort.
Yeah, and I think importantly, that's most of the country as well. I think this is where the majority of the population is far divorced from this insane rhetoric that you hear going on at the moment in Westminster.
I just don't know why they're so scared of using... Why do you think they're so scared of using the word? Because obviously Rishi Sunak said it was wrong. Catherine Fletcher, I think, won the prize for calling Lee Anderson a Wally. And nobody seemed to want to say Islamophobic or racist. It was very much like, I think in Raf's piece in The Guardian, that classic euphemism like, not the words I would have chosen. And it's like, well, why, particularly when we're talking about like the One Nation law, who clearly don't like Lee Anderson and don't want the party to go his way, why aren't there more people coming out? It's poor old, Baroness Barcy going out there always on her own.
Always,
as
single-handedly.
usual. And it's like, just say it.
There was a very confused interview with Paul Scully on the news agency the other day where he came out, because he'd said no-go areas. That was the thing that people had jumped on. And he'd said, and I found the interview genuinely confusing to listen to, because I couldn't, even by the end of it, and I think the interviewers couldn't work out either quite what he was trying to say, because he was trying to say, I think, I didn't mean no-go areas in a conspiratorial way. That's I didn't realise that was used in a conspiratorial way. I simply meant there are some areas that people wouldn't want to go. So it's like, okay, but you're still sort of saying the same thing.
He cycled through 360 degrees.
Yeah.
He seems to apologise and worked himself through the apology in such detail that he'd accidentally, in a labyrinth of his own words, ended up facing the same way he started.
Yeah, and he kept saying, well, look, Lee Anderson, what I was trying to do was take the heat out of the situation by saying, we've got to talk about these things because these things are really important. And again, but what things are important? Yeah, but the thing...
No, they love that. We've got to have an honest conversation.
Yeah. We need a debate.
About what?
Yeah.
But the reason they won't bring up the word Islamophobia, I think, is down to pure PR, that the more they parrot the word, the more it becomes attached to them. So they're just trying to backtrack from the word as far as they can, even if in their hearts, some of the One Nation lot do genuinely think this is an example of pure
let's
Islamophobia.
attach it to them. A 2021 survey found that 58% of Tory members believed there were no-go areas of British cities where Muslims enforced Sharia law and drove out non-Muslims. 47% said Islam was a threat to the British way of life. 24 sitting or former Tory councillors have been exposed for Islamophobic and racist posts. Last summer, the Muslim Council of Britain said Islamophobia in the party was institutional, tolerated by the leadership, and seen as acceptable by great swathes of the party membership. There's not been an EHRC investigation. Matt, why is this not as big a scandal as Labour anti-Semitism? To me, you cannot fight one without the other. They are two sides of the same very dirty coin.
Well, I mean, I think it obviously is a massive problem, and it's got worse. There's a Hope Not Hate poll that's just come out today when we're speaking on Wednesday, saying that, in fact, those numbers have got even worse. So 58% of people in the Tory party in this poll think that Islam is a threat to the British way of life, while only 18% believe the two are compatible. And also, I think most importantly, Tory party members are far more extreme than the general public. That compared to 58% of Tory party members who think Islam's a threat to the way of British life, 30% of the UK public do. So it's basically double. And I think that's the answer: is that the Tory party is very Islamophobic, basically, and its membership comes from a part of the country or a part of society that is very Islamophobic, essentially, or large parts of it are, because the right-wing press is pretty Islamophobic, and because the numbers are quite big, and therefore, I mean, even with the anti-Semitism issue in Labour, which is obviously massively controversial, I don't think anyone would ever have said over half of the Labour Party's membership is anti-Semitic, and said, and that would never have come out in a survey. It would never have come out in a poll. And so the idea that obviously the Tory party does have a huge problem with it, but it's almost like it's such a big problem that for them to kind of have a go at trying to solve it, I don't know how they do that, because they have tried to solve it. There have been reports. There was the Singh report a couple of years ago, which was actually seen as a bit of a whitewash, but it focused on the party processes rather than the sort of wider issues. But it said there were various recommendations. One of the recommendations was people in local Tory party groups have to do training on this, and I think it goes back to them saying, well, I don't really want to.
I think a big difference, just in terms of the way Westminster functions and the way politics operates, and it's not a criticism, it's quite normal. The key difference is that with Labour, the reason everyone started talking about anti-Semitism and the problems and how widespread it was because Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and people will have different views on how much culpability he has to bear for that. My own view is that at the very least, the way he handled it, some of the language he used, gave a huge amount of permission to an awful lot of people who were absolutely itching to say all sorts of paranoid things about Jews. His leadership, became a magnet for some of that stuff. But he was the leader of the party. Now, Rishi Sunak is a very different proposition as a leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, the reality is, he is the first non-white leader of a British political party and Prime Minister. I mean, and so the question, in the macro picture, if you're saying the Conservative Party has a big problem with racism, which I think it does, it's much harder to attach it to the leadership, and that changes the way that the issue is debated. And I think, and that's absolutely right, it's actually a grassroots thing where it's much more prevalent. I remember going to a meeting at a Conservative Party conference a few years ago where there was a presentation, and it was all about demographic changes at constituency level, and basically saying that these seats that we will have to win, the Conservatives will have to win in the next decades, these are the people who are moving out, these are the people who are moving in, and what's happening is that this population is growing, and if we as a party don't start speaking to and engaging with and winning the votes of Muslim communities, we're going to lose all these seats. And these Conservative activists sitting next to me, just muttering these absolute horror, like, this is appalling, this is disgraceful. Not in the sense of, like, we're not speaking to these people, but in the sense of, oh my goodness, these places are being taken over by the Muslims. They didn't think for a second the response to that might be, maybe we should actually also try and represent these people. They were just felt besieged by the idea.
That reminds me of the Republican Party in 2012, where they did a similar, they did a process of, why did we lose in 2012? What can we do better? And from what I remember, the conclusion was, we need to appeal to a broader slice of society. We need to appeal to the Latino community, to the Black community. And then Trump came in and just sort of wiped all of that away. And it feels like that's kind of where the Tories are at the moment, is, are they going to go that way or the other way? Like, they're kind of in that.
Well, before we get into the politics, I just wanted to ask you, Raf, Anderson says he was attacking, Islamists. Now, we will all remember that there are periods where there were bombings, like 7/7. There were murders, David Amos MP and Lee Rigby and so on. There were definitely times where Islamist extremism, there seemed to be a reason to be talking about it. Suddenly there's all this talk about Islamism and the failure of multiculturalism and the collapse in social cohesion. What reality basis is there for that beyond prejudice?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think that point that you make, that we're back to having a conversation about whether Muslim communities generally are incubating a particular kind of radicalism that is a particular kind of threat to British society. Actually, that's a conversation that has been had at least since 9/11, on and off, and keeps being had when there are terrorist attacks. But actually, that in itself is an iteration about conversations about multiculturalism that go back, the sort of the same pattern of the conversation was had, going back to Enoch Powell, with a different community in mind. So how do you disaggregate a pattern of anxious response to migration and migrant communities that people think aren't adequately integrated and a particular political moment? It comes back to this point that people can be careful with their language, and they can articulate the problems in ways that don't seem designed to be willfully capitalizing on ignorance and deliberately tapping into the reservoirs of fear and anger to fuel their own political projects. It's possible to have those conversations. That's not the way British politics is set up.
Hannah, let's talk about the Tory politics. A really interesting piece in Politico asks, can anyone stop Britain's Tories going full Trump? And speaks to some disgruntled One Nation MPs, very few of whom have denounced Lee Anderson. Do you get the impression that there is a serious fight back plan from that piece?
No, but also I think that I'm not entirely surprised by that, because it isn't actually quite the right time for the serious fight back. They've got to let it all unravel. And also, where they're positioning, I think the party is so in flux at the moment that I'm sure individual members who might have previously considered themselves part of a One Nation grouping might not even know where they stand. Just as an example of that, one of the most purely One Nation things I've seen said this week was actually a comment by Jacob Rees-Mogg on Shamima Begum and whether or not she should have been repatriated and tried here in the UK, which obviously, yes, I think she should, and I've written on that before, but it was quite staggering to me to find myself in quite crashingly loud agreement with Jacob Rees-Mogg, not a position I
he just did that
ever
as a
expected
to
to
wind
be
you
in.
up.
It
clock,
worked.
yeah.
But it is an important point that it did maybe pause for a moment this week and think, that there are points of agreement between all of us, and the disgusting thing about the culture wars is that it drives a wedge between everybody. And this moment at which I could say, look, I fully agree with this man on this, and I disagree with him on about virtually every other thing he's ever stood up and said in public, but here we are in complete agreement. And so I think the Conservative Party, many of them, I think they don't know where they stand and who they ally to at the moment, and it's got to let itself all play out before any kind of fight back can.
One line that really pulled me up short, just quote the piece, I have no idea who the moderate candidate is, one current minister said. Penny Mordaunt is good and well liked, but she's mad on the woke stuff, referring to Mordaunt's support for trans issues. And I was like, you're literally talking about saving your party from going full Trump. And I don't think anybody would describe Penny Mordaunt as woke. It's just that she's one of the few Tories who doesn't vocally dislike trans people. And I thought, do you have any idea what, if you're ruling her out because of that, then you're an idiot.
And also the interesting thing is the only thing they ever think of when they attach woke to her is the trans issue, when actually she has been quite interesting on things like, race issues in the UK, on equal opportunities, gender equal opportunities in terms of pay and things like that. She's talked about these things, but that's not what they've got in mind. They've got the trans debate in mind. So they're not even thinking about that comprehensively when they make a comment like that.
Matt, one thing the piece made me think of was that most of the One Nation heavyweights, the household names in the sense that any MPs are, were Remainers ousted by Johnson over Brexit and forced to make podcasts instead. Are we seeing the consequences of that? Did that fatally unbalance the Tories, removing your Gawks and your Greaves and your Stewarts?
I mean, what a terrible punishment being forced to make podcasts.
That's why. This is the only
that's
reason
what-
I do it.
Exactly, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
forced to.
I'm still working out my sentence, but it did remind me of that famous Yeats quote about the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, and that does feel like that really represents the Tory party at the moment. That the best, which of course doesn't mean good, but they are,
as Yates said, the least bad, lack all
the least annoying. And I think people like Rory Stewart are being very passionate on their podcasts, and they are making lots of points, but yeah, they're nowhere near power in a weird way. And I think, but it goes back to the fact that obviously UKIP and the Brexit Party have always had this sort of slightly parasitic relationship with the Tories, and they've kind of infiltrated and slowly dragged the Tories further and further into the right, and that's what's happened. They've taken over the host.
Well, yeah, Rafa, I wanted to ask you about that because GB News, whose owner Paul Marshall has been endorsing extreme Islamophobia on Twitter, reports that GB News host Lee Anderson has been meeting with GB News host Richard Tice about joining Reform. And I mean, is that the key to Sunak? I mean, Sunak, he did remove the whip, fair enough, but he's been a lot more sort of nervous about disciplining his MPs compared to, if you actually look at some of the stuff that Starmer has suspended MPs for, the degree of anti-Semitism alleged is far, far smaller. And obviously Suella Braverman and Liz Truss sail on in their crazy ships. So is it as simple as that, is that Sunak thinks, well, if I am too harsh on this, Anderson will give Reform their first MP, the other freaks might join him, and that he's just basically too scared?
I think broadly, yes. And ultimately, what I understand from the way Downing Street is sort of wargaming the election threat that they have, there are a bunch of people who are switching from the Conservatives straight to Labour. They're probably never coming back. There's an awful lot of people who are saying they don't know what they're going to do. Most of those people who voted Conservative in 2019, when you look at what they believe, what they care about, the things that come up are immigration, their Reform talking points. And so, Richard Tice and Reform are looking at those people and going, that's how we get from 10 to 15%. That's how we really break through. And the Tories are thinking, if we can hold on to those people and bring them back, that's the difference between just losing the election and getting absolutely annihilated. So, yes, there is a sort of psephological calculation, but I do think it's hard to sort of separate that out from Matt's point about, a turning point was, yes, Boris Johnson taking the whip away from the Tory moderates. Look, no one ever got poor betting against the courage of the moderate wing of the Conservative Party. That's but also that 2019 election when Farage stood a bunch of people down and gave Boris Johnson a much bigger majority. That was the moment. I don't know if you remember The Fly, the Jeff Goldblum version, where he sort of, the Fly joins him in the teleport machine, and then there's that scene where he kind of is trying to understand what's going on, and he zeroes in on his own sort of DNA, and then zooms back out again, and it's the Fly. He's fused his own genetic material with the Fly. That's what happened in that 2019 election. That was the point at which Conservative DNA, ideological DNA, fused with the Brexit Party, and it became a different organisation to the one it was when David Cameron was leader. And I don't think there's any going back from that.
Well, I did notice, just to wrap up, I thought Starmer had a very good line in PMQs, go, these are not the Tories your parents voted for. We're going to move the order around a little bit this week because we've got a big basket of But Your Emails. So we're going to do Under the Radar now. Hannah.
Okay, so it's a housing one. This month, the monthly spend on temporary accommodation in London reached 90 million a month. So that's a huge amount of your council tax, a huge amount of public money going every month just in the capital on housing people in emergency and temporary accommodation because we have such an epic housing crisis. I think if that figure doesn't kind of sharpen minds, then, where are we as we head into the next government?
Matt.
So this is about medication. There's been a massive shortage of medication specifically for ADHD, huge UK-wide shortage for many, many months now, and it just keeps getting worse, basically. Right. The charity ADHD UK said it's recorded a significant decline in the availability of medicines, with only 11% of people with ADHD having their normal prescription in January, a drop from 52% in September. Currently, around 150,000 people are experiencing issues with medication. it's all to do with global factors, higher demand, manufacturing issues, and it could be several weeks, if not months, before it's resolved. And it does mean that there are people suffering with ADHD, often people who've maybe only recently been diagnosed, who maybe found it as a sort of lifeline and it's been taken away. And sadly, it feels like that's going to be something that could happen more and more with more medicines over various different conditions. You know, it's not Brexit related directly, but Brexit is certainly not going to help in the future with other medicines, because the EU is very much going to try and get as many of those medicines as it can, and we're going to be left on the outside. So, yeah, it's been a problem that's been kind of slowly getting worse and worse, and unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to be resolved anytime soon.
Raf?
So there's a very good organisation called the Local Government Information Unit, which is a really nerdy thing. And I think it's always important, I mean, we talk about stories that go onto the radar, but the whole of local government, local politics always massively goes onto the radar because we have such a centralised country and Westminster politics dominates everything. But the scale of the financial crisis, just slow motion wreck unfolding in local government, is extraordinary. And they've published, so the LGIU have published a report, and among many harrowing things, what they find is that they survey a lot of councillors and a lot of councils, and about 1 in 10 say they expect to have to trigger a Section 114 order, and that is basically, it's a techie thing, but it's the mechanism by which the council goes, we're broke, because councils are legally obliged to balance their budgets. So if they can't, and they're effectively bankrupt, they have to use this Section 114 of the Local Government Act. And so 1 in 10 think probably this year, and about half, 50%, probably in the next 5 years. So that is, if you just think, most people's actual experience of what the state is, what government is actually local. It's, the state of the streets. It's like driving through the potholes. It's whether your bins got collected. And so actually the point at which you just aren't delivering basic services at local level and it's just falling apart actually has a corrosive effect on the whole of the democracy. It just delegitimizes the whole idea of what politics can do and what government can do. And I'm sure that's an engine of all the turbulence, all the radicalization, all the polarization that we've had, and then that is all properly happening under the radar.
Fortunately, tax cuts will help councils grow.
Well, our two stories are directly related, though, because one of the primary drivers of bankrupting councils is cost of temporary accommodation. And so, when people say, "Oh, just the housing crisis," it's actually driving radicalization.
Well, mine is about American politics. I get driven mad by the framing of the primaries. That if you look at New York Times or I think even The Guardian, it was kind of like, again, like Trump romps to victory over Nikki Haley in Michigan, while Biden faces stiff opposition from people who are very angry about his Gaza policy. In fact, Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman, tried to get people to vote uncommitted, which is almost like a protest vote. That underperformed, got to about 13%, which is not that much higher than the number of uncommitted for Obama in 2012, at a much less fractious time. So Biden sort of overperformed the predictions. Trump underperformed. And in fact, as someone pointed out, if you look at the polls, he underperformed in Iowa by 20 points, Michigan by 20 points, New Hampshire and South Carolina by about 10 points. So the story that I'm seeing is that there are far more Republicans who don't want Trump than there are Democrats who don't want Biden. And I think perhaps the reason for the bizarre framing is the traditional idea that, if you're in opposition, the primaries are always more contested. And if you're the incumbent president, you're expected to just walk it. But Trump is the Republican incumbent. He is the former president. He has always been the front runner. And I just feel that there should be more recognition that he is actually getting fewer votes than you would expect, and as the polls predicted. And that these attempts to kind of challenge Biden, and there were some third-party candidates as well who got 3% each, are falling short. And I think perhaps this framing has contributed to the sort of, I think, excessive gloom over the next election.
I think that it's very interesting that there is a sense in which the morbid dread and fear of Trump coming back also has, and this is maybe a slightly weird psychoanalytical approach to it, an element of fantasy as well, and that there's a kind of way in which a liberal opinion which is frustrated and disappointed by Biden almost, whether consciously or unconsciously, craves the kind of dissident resistance, moral purity you'd get standing up to actual fascism, as opposed to having to engage with the messy, murky moral compromise of accepting the moderate Democrat who you can't really get inspired by and is frankly a bit old.
Now, our inbox has been deluged with questions from Patreon backers, and we can normally only answer one a week. So we've decided to devote the second half of the show to a But Your Emails special. Let's dig in. Melissa Brandsberg asks, now that he's 16 months into the job, what is Rishi Sunak's motivation? Politicians are generally motivated by service, power, or greed, but none of those qualities seem to fit. None of his plans are really particularly unique or bold. Stopping boats, banning vapes, adding more maths. He doesn't need speaking circuit money. His ideology seems to be malleable. Why is he there? I mean, this is a great question, right?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I think it's such a great question. And, I think, first of all, in terms of what he believes, that's important because I don't think it's quite true that he believes nothing at all. He is just sort of an incarnation of the leader page of the Spectator magazine. It's a sort of a set of this is going to sound really snobbish, but a kind of slightly lazy, upper middle brow, radical conservative Thatcherism long after Thatcher stopped being interesting or relevant, and that is what's fascinating about that is that given how young he is relatively, that's quite a weird set of beliefs to have. He's younger than me, and I think I'm not that old. So he's in mid-40s. So demographically, he's exceptionally. I mean, there aren't that many people voting Tory who have those views in that segment. I think so. I think it's something quite unimaginative about his politics. And in terms of why he does it, in that sense, I think he's very similar to David Cameron. I think, they have lots of things that not in common. I mean, David Cameron came from money. He's basically an aristocrat. Rishi Sunak is son of self-made immigrants. But they've had that very elite education. Rishi Sunak was head boy at Winchester. And I think once you've sort of been groomed in that environment and you made lots of money, there is a sense of, well, politics is quite a cool thing to do. It's sort of show business for ugly people. It's sport for the weeds. It's kind of quite a genuinely interesting thing to do. So if you have the education and the grooming and the training to do Prime Minister and it's available to you, why would you not? I mean, that would be an awesome job to do. And probably you think you'd be quite good at it.
That's like Cameron said. Yeah. I wonder if it's the same thing. I think I'd be quite good at it.
I kind of both agree and disagree with you, because I do agree with everything you're saying about his kind of background, that schooling and kind of environment that made him. But I think it's less a kind of, oh, this is a cool thing to do, maybe I'll give it a go, and more of a sense of sort of obligation, like this is something I should do. I've been head boy, I've gone on to Oxford, this is the next thing, this is what I ought to do, this is what I'm expected to do. And I've recently written a profile for a piece coming up for the election about him, and read a recent biography that apparently there was someone in his obviously private primary school who had described him as being a future PM then. So it's like this kind of, oh, maybe that's what I ought to do, was implanted at the earliest stage.
What kind of freak do you have to be for someone to think you're a future PM in primary school?
I know, I thought that. It really stepped out at me. Now, I kind of have some sympathy for this, because school I grew up in, very, very different, but there was this sense that I ought to get to university because I was clever enough, and I ought to get a job and have a stable life and get the hell out of Didcot, which I did all of those things. And I've got some sympathy with him now, because now I'm in my 40s and I've done all the things I wanted to do and I don't know what to do next. And I suspect he's about a year older than me. He's in exactly the same position.
I do find it fascinating that he radiates resentment at how hard it is and how little gratitude he's getting for it. I mean, he just finds it so hard to conceal the fact that this turns out to be way less fun, way harder, with way less gratitude than he was led to believe. And he's not very good at sort of just sucking it up.
Well,
I mean, Prime Minister, mate.
If you're head boy, you're used to people praising you. That's
and you don't have to do much as head boy.
Yeah, but also I think
head boy to the budget or something. Are you?
He's come from a world where you do a good job, you get praised. You do a better job, you get praised. And then politics just isn't that. Politics is the exact opposite of that. It doesn't matter how good a job there'll always be something to screw it up, and there'll always be someone else who makes a mistake that you then have to defend. And so, yeah, I agree. I think he does seem, but I think he's probably just. I think now it's just inertia, isn't it? It's like it'd be more hassle to not have the job than it would be to have the job. Can you imagine, like, it would cause so much faff, and he would have to kind of go out and do a press conference, and all of his mates would hate him because they're all going to lose their jobs. Like, he's now stuck, I think.
Tom Williams asks, if it was Jeremy Corbyn's Labour who were in opposition whilst the Tories are doing their current death spiral, what do you think the polls would look like?
I think it's a really good question.
It's a very good question.
And I was trying to think about this.
It's, I think it divides people.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the closest we have to that as a sort of historical precedent would be the kind of chaos of Theresa May's Brexit years, where the Tories were polling pretty badly and it was all chaos. And then it was an incredibly bad election campaign that she ran, and therefore they lost. But still, Labour didn't win. And they did a lot better than people were expecting. So I suspect it would just be a lot closer. I think maybe Labour would just about have a bit of a lead. I think Corbyn would obviously still have all the issues that he had in terms of the press would be attacking him about all sorts of things. So yeah, I can't see them with a 20-point lead as they currently do, but I think they would have a bit of a lead. But yeah, the election campaign would be pretty bloody.
I think one of the things that I argued with Corbynites about was the fact that Corbyn was very popular with the people who liked him. They loved him. And yet the people that he alienated were people who were just like, I don't really like the Tories, but not you.
Boris Johnson, going into that 2019 election, his personal ratings were lower than Theresa May's were in 2017.
Right. Yeah.
Forget that. It was all about Jeremy Corbyn.
So because of that unpopularity, because it's so alienated, like moderate Tories and people who might vote Lib Dem but didn't want to let Labour in. Like the thing about, there are a lot of people who are absolutely under no circumstances can this man be Prime Minister. And Starmer doesn't really have that. There aren't that many people who are just like, oh, I couldn't countenance that. So they're much happier to switch to Labour or to vote for the Lib Dems and therefore help Labour in. So I agree. I don't know whether, I still feel like this Tory party stinks so badly of death that I still think a Corbyn-led Labour would probably win.
I think it would be much more fragmented. If you remember that 2019 European parliamentary election where the Tories came fifth.
Yeah.
He came fifth. And one of the things that actually surprised me is the resilience of the two-party system in England, actually, how despite all the fractiousness and the fragmentation of 2016 to 2020, it sort of pinged back to just basically Labour-Tory camps. I think if you still had Jeremy Corbyn leading Labour Party, that would have been so hard to maintain. I mean, obviously there was attempted splits in Labour and it failed.
Change UK,
all that stuff. But I just think there would be something else, other things polling in the 15-20 zone, and the two-party system would look really shaky.
I think the one thing that we can say is that turnout would be so low that it would be a real depressing moment for parliamentary democracy, because you just look around and say, well, somebody's won, but it doesn't represent anywhere near the majority of the people.
Tom Pegg asks, Twixter, very clever, appears to have become a horrible seething cesspit of extremism, more so than ever before, yet it still seems to be where news folk hang out and where the news goes for stories and quotes. Do the panel feel that relying on an increasingly extremist platform will impact on the slant of the news, and if they do, in what way?
I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but I would say the only reason I'm still on it is because that everywhere else on social media is either totally insipid or influencer driven and just doesn't feel like a space for news. So it has retained its newsy sense, I suppose. But it doesn't do what it used to do. It's not as useful as it used to be as a journalist.
Not at all.
It's irritating now. But I think it's important to remember this is not where most people get their news from either. We can feel like we're in that world and it can feel very essential. But most people are actually still getting it from Facebook. That's still globally the primary driver of social news. Or places like TikTok, which I haven't experimented with at all, so I can't tell you anything about that. So no, I don't actually think it will have any more impact than it already has.
Yeah, I spend very little time on it now. I've sort of drifted away just because it became so appalling and I despise Elon Musk. And my sense is it has become substantially less relevant. It does get quoted. So, obviously, Sola Braverman might, or whoever it might be, says something on, or actually more like Kemi Badenoch says something on X, and therefore that gets quoted. But that's basically like issuing a press release. I think you've had a lot less of the the sort of iterative dynamics of the site generating their own stories in the way. If you remember what happened to Emily Thornberry with the tweeting the picture of the van, the flags in whichever by-election it was. That was an entirely Twitter-generated news event, and actually, I think there's less of that now.
If the question is about are journalists going to be swayed, and they think, oh well, this is what people are thinking, I think that because there are so many people with like Union Jacks in their bios and the blue ticks, and we all know what that means now. I think it's really clear that you feel like you're wading through trash. You don't get the impression that like, oh, I guess they're just a lot more fascist in Britain now.
It's not a zeitgeist wire.
No,
it just isn't.
No, so I think people are very, very conscious of the fact that the reason it has changed is not because the country or the world has changed, but because Elon Musk is in charge and he likes white supremacists. And so I don't worry that it will skew the news. I think the news has bigger problems.
It does.
Isn't that the truth?
It feels to me like it's become more of a broadcast medium now. That I still use it a lot to put my videos out, put my opinions out.
Oh, I've seen.
I'm not interested as much in what people are replying because, as you say, so much of it is either porn bots or blue tick weirdos or whatever, But I think also for me with Twitter, like a year or two ago, I just have become incredibly quick to block now. So my Twitter is I've just got thousands and thousands of people I blocked. And therefore my Twitter doesn't feel that much different in a way. Like I just get rid of those people straight away. And it's sort of still a lot of my friends and people I know.
It's just thinner, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what I find.
There's
just less of it because I think for the same reason I've got high levels of digital media hygiene but there's less out there.
But the problem is that compared to, I'm on Threads and Blue Sky and all those places, but they all just feel much less fun.
I hate Threads. It's so tedious.
Yeah.
I
It's
abandoned that within about a week.
God, I can't bear it.
Yeah, it's basically the worst of Instagram and Twitter combined.
But what someone needs to do is basically get like 2011 Twitter. That was the perfect social media platform, pretty much.
Yeah.
Ian Holderbeck. This sounds like one for you, Hannah. What is it about the Liberal Democrats that fails to cut through to the general population? With the Tories polling so badly, why aren't more people considering the Lib Dems rather than Labour as the alternative? Is it all student loans, FPTP and lack of name recognition? Or is there something more fundamental about their policies? Where are all my fellow centrist dads hiding? That's a real cry for help.
Hello, centrist dad. I'm a centrist mum who actually comes from a centrist dad Lib Dem voting household.
Wow.
I think the problem is Ed Davey, I'm sorry to say. I've known Ed Davey on and off for a while. He used to be housing spokesperson. He's a great guy. He's a really good bloke with really solid, serious political, motivation and beliefs. He just lacks any ability to connect through all of the mediums that you need now: broadcast, social media. He's got no charisma.
And the coalition. And they chose somebody with a coalition connection.
Yeah, but we're so far away from that now. Clegg's gone, Swinson's gone. I think that there would be an opportunity in the current environment for the right person to reinvigorate the Lib Dems, but it is not him.
They've got so many other structural problems as well. So they can't just be more Remainy than the Remainers because they actually need to win back seats. Just like Labour, got exactly the same problem as Labour on the Brexit thing. They actually, places they need to win. There are people who voted for Brexit who don't want to be reminded about what a toss idea it was. There are an awful lot of lowercase LD Liberal Democrats in other parties. It's basically like some sort of be a group of, it's like politics was drawn up by some colonial cartographer, and the land that was Liberal Democrats was actually parceled out to other parties.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, actually, we should have our own country called Liberal Democrats. Well, no, they're everywhere else. If you were doing to rationalisation of British politics, you'd basically get Dominic Grieve and David Gauke and the Liberal Right for Conservative Party, smush them together with most of the Lib Dems, say, right, you're a kind of like a centre-right pro-business Liberal party. The Lib Dems who actually hate that stuff, you go off and join the Labour Party. Some of you join the Greens. Other rest of the Tories go off with a reform and become a mad right-wing nationalist party, and they're right, job's good.
But I also want to know, as a side point, what is it about the Lib Dems that produces people like Liz Truss and Paul Marshall, and just why there's so many absolute right-wing lunatics that have a past with the Lib Dems? This is one for Matt.
Hello.
Sam Proctor, does the Right Honourable Sir Geoff Jeffrey, who's a character in Matt's stand-up show, belong to any of the 5 families? And if so, which one?
Good question. I think if he were here, he'd be like, well, of course, the Tory party is like a family in that we all hate each other. And there are a number of groupings. I've been a member of different ones. Obviously, there's the European Research Group, the Northern Research Group, the Common Sense Group. Much easier for them. They don't need to do any research. Just go with their guts, which can be quite considerable. You don't hear that on the BBC. But no, if I had to stick to one particular family, I'd say I'm part of the Southern Gut Feelings gang. Yeah. I hang around my local Wetherspoons, have a couple of pints, see what people are saying, and put it on expenses. That's how it works.
Nice. Gervais Miller. Suddenly it's gone very heavy. That was very funny. Now we're going heavy. Why do parts of the Labour movement prefer to focus on international issues such as the Middle East and Yemen rather than domestic issues? The Labour left don't seem to like trying to persuade people by meeting them where they are mentally and therefore leave a void for the Tories to often fill. Okay, I'm going to start this one. I do think there is a thing, and I think it's sort of actually I think it's a Cold War thing. Like, I'm fascinated by the origins of sort of anti-Zionism as an idea that really starts in 1970. It's very much pushed by the Soviet Union. I'm not saying it was like a Soviet agent or something, but it very much became a part of the international left. And I think one of the reasons Corbyn actually got in so much trouble was because that was his obsession. And that most people, well, rightly or wrongly, don't really care about foreign policy. And it's very divisive and actively repellent to people who disagree with you on that. And so there are people who are very good at their jobs, like, say, Mick Lynch is a very good union leader. As soon as he starts talking about foreign policy, it's just the usual kind of nonsense. And there's a lot of people on the left who, you know, they're not great on Ukraine. And, you know, I might agree with them to some extent on Palestine, but they're really not great at framing it in a way that might speak to the unconverted. And it seems to be an addiction, maybe rooted in the old idea of kind of socialist internationalism, which is a noble idea that you should care about countries all around the world. But it seems to get them so much more excited than the Green New Deal, or how you're going to sort out council financing. And it gives you a kind of like a moral battleground where it's like, well, these are the evil people and these are the heroic rebels. And the problem is, if you think like that, you end up sort of going hooray for the Houthis or whatever. And politically, it always seems to me, I mean, people can be concerned about whatever they're concerned about. Politically, that always seems to me to be a disaster, because most people don't care. And you run the risk of making people very angry and freaked out. Finally, Simon Gates with a counterfactual. Since the 2007 financial crisis, the UK seems to have been on an inevitable path to where we are now. Was there a turning point when anyone could have done anything to avoid it? Gordon Brown going for the early election, Ed Balls having the guts to disagree with austerity, the Lib Dems in coalition, or not helping Boris? What do you think?
I mean, the very obvious one, you know, I suppose is going back very slightly before that, is Ed Miliband not standing against his brother, isn't it? That's the classic. And, you know, I say this, at the time I was a member of the Fabian, so I had a vote. I've never been a member of the Labour Party because I'm a journalist, so I don't believe I should be. But I was a Fabian, so I had a vote and I voted for him.
I voted for Ed Miliband too. I love Ed Miliband.
I obviously think he's brilliant, but that was the turning point.
Okay.
I don't think he's brilliant, and I didn't vote for him.
Fair enough.
I think he had brilliant principles.
He's a nice guy.
Yeah,
no, brilliant as in I like
Lovely
him.
guy,
I wouldn't say that brilliant
He
as
was
in
not a
like
brilliant
one of the great
politician,
politicians of his age.
Yeah, that's the problem.
So I have two, one US, one British. US, the moment that Obama, after the financial crisis, brought all of the CEOs of all the big banking companies into a room. And apparently, I remember reading this somewhere, they genuinely thought they were about to be arrested. They genuinely thought, look, we fucked up bad here. And he has all the reason in the world to, say you are all in trouble. And instead he said, how can I help you? How can I help you? How can we get this system back on its feet by not rocking the boat? And I think that was a crucial, possibly the biggest turning point in a way of his presidency in some ways. And the other one, British one, a smaller one in a way, but also important, Theresa May's Mansion House speech when she put down her red lines on Brexit. And again, I remember reading something fascinating about that, which was because she won the Tory party leadership without a fight, because can't remember her name now, pulled out. What's the name?
Andrew Leadsom.
Andrew Leadsom, yes. Pulled out because of the thing she said about being a mother. That Theresa May was going to do that speech as a sort of campaign speech and throw out all these crazy ideas about, let's do a red line on this, red line on this. But then it became a prime ministerial speech, and nobody had sort of really thought through, what does that mean if you rule out being part of a customs union, all that kind of stuff. And so she ended up putting much more pressure on the red lines than she intended to, perhaps, arguably. And that meant that the whole Brexit debate sort of from the beginning was scuppered.
So that's the show. We didn't get through all the questions, but we will save them and get through some more in the coming weeks. Thank you so much to Hannah.
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you.
And Raf.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop. And a special thanks to all our Patreon backers, new and old. As I said recently, it's a tricky old time for podcasts, and we literally couldn't do this without you. You could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more and unending gratitude. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.